Well, call this the non-essential on a snow day essential emergency podcast. Jeremie Poplin, John Holcomb here from News on Six, and we just had some things to get off our chest. And since we won't be able to do it necessarily during a sportscast today, then that's why we're here on social media. Just a little bit something new. Pop, how are you?
I'm good. I hope everyone in Tulsa, as I'm several miles from what seems to be ground zero right now, from where the storm is hitting. But yeah, looking like a little winter wonderland outside my window here.
Well, so you've enjoyed it, right? Because some people aren't enjoying it.
Anytime I don't have to actually get out in it, I would put that in the yes, I'm enjoying it category.
Well, I mean, being inside sure beats a shot in the eyeball, as I've said before. So some of us
that it does.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Enough of this, or maybe more of this. Maybe people will want more of this. Who knows? A couple of things. We just wanted to just explore some current sports topics, and I guess the biggest one, as far as we're concerned, given the relative lack of success of our local college basketball teams, it's going to be football. Well, it's going to be football anyway, most of the time. Ross Dellinger's story, Yahoo Sports, about the talks with the SEC and Big Ten advancing and how they are taking control like the Death Star of college football and college football playoff. And it looks like that we could be at 14 or 16 teams very soon. I'll just give my quick take on it. I love it. Let's get to 16. But I've always been that way. What's your take?
So I sometimes I think that we're trying to fix a problem that we don't necessarily have in a lot of instances, and I don't know where I'm at as far as difference between 12 to 14 to 16. I think it's just a matter of time before we get to a certain point, John, where we're going to add teams no matter what, whether it's in 26 or if they were to push it down the road a little bit further. What I don't necessarily agree with is this rush to judgment after 1 year of having 12 teams. I don't think that that's enough in terms of context and data points to really get a good feel for whether or not that the addition of 2 or 4 is really going to make that big of a difference. And I do think that there are things that are inside the 12 that could have been adjusted, whether that's the way that the seating process went about, various other on campus experiences that they had that they could have tried before they got to this. That's also me being incredibly naive and not understanding how this process in the landscape of sports works now, which it's all beholden to the almighty dollar. And I think we would both agree that this is about trying to generate more revenue and squeeze as much as they can out of television networks while still bringing together the two biggest entities in the SEC and the Big Ten.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, in the end, everything's about money. And I would say, I'll admit fully, I'm a huge NCAA March Madness, NCAA tournament fan, have been for years. Now, I don't think they need to go to 90 teams or whatever they've kind of thrown out there recently. I think it's at a really good size now, even though you have 330 some odd schools that play. But my point on that is the charm of the NCAA tournament on the first weekend are the 16s beating the ones, which had never happened until recently. Or the upsets when you can just feel one team getting tighter and there's not that much separation anymore between a 5 and a 12, for example. Just depends on how your regular season went. I think that can be achieved on a much smaller scale, but also you're talking about, in this instance, maybe 16 teams. What we just did was 12. You may not see that every year. You don't necessarily see it every year in basketball outside of 1 or 2, you can almost guarantee. So my point is get it to 16 because there's more people involved in the party. I do think you are exactly right on the rush to judgment. And I'd go back to the Indiana at Notre Dame game, which, it's a frozen tundra of South Bend. And who knew that Indiana was his quarterback who was playing on a torn ACL or whatever it was coming down the stretch. And they fall behind, slow start, and already very respected and great announcers on the broadcasters are basically telling you Indiana doesn't belong here. That sounds to me more like an agenda being pushed than an actual, hey, let's step back for a second.
I'm with you on the agenda front because I think you can go back over the course of the last 2 to 3 years, heck, even in that 2 year window. If you remember, a 12-team proposal was put in front of college football. And who was the one entity, the big bad bully in the room that said, sorry, we don't want this right now? And that was the whole reasoning behind the alliance in the first place. And that's why it's agenda driven, because you mean that our opinions have changed in a span of just 2 years when we've been trying to drag college football into the current landscape of sports for it seems like the last 50 years we've been having these discussions about changes that you can make to the sport. So it is agenda driven. The problem I think that most people are going to have with it, and I want to stress, a lot of this will come down to where your affiliation as a fan is, because if you're an OU fan right now and you're in the SEC, like a lot of what you hear is like the Charlie Brown teachers speak, which is wah 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 wah. We don't care. We're here. We got the invite to where the big boys play, so to speak, in a lot of people's opinions. So to me, the rest of college football has to be very careful, knowing that the sport is essentially bending to the will and to the whim of two commissioners that are doing what they feel is best for their own constituents inside their leagues. But I'm not quite sure that it's the best for the rest of college football. And I guess the question then becomes, is that even their responsibility?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. The problem is there's nobody that's filling that void with any sort of authority here, and that's the NCAA. That's why you've heard so many coaches come out and say, you know what, college football needs a commissioner, and it needs to be Nick Saban. I mean, Gundy said it. James Franklin said it. Other coaches have said it, and I'm sure Saban says, well, you know, it's kind of easy making money doing these Aflac commercials. Maybe I don't want to be the commissioner of college football. Um, some of those other details, though, with the Dellinger story and the talks, which are supposed to take place Wednesday in New Orleans, and I don't think they get the final thing hammered out, but they're advancing it. The SEC and the Big Ten each getting 4 automatic qualifiers if they were to go to 14 or 16. Not shocked by that because Pop, they're the two kids on the playground when you had the big kickball game, deciding they're just going to kick it to each other over by themselves.
They are. I would ask you first. Are you more of a fan of? I think you said you're more of a fan of 16 compared to 14. I think 14 fits better if you're going to make this move, just because of the way that the optics are going to be with all the other pieces that they try to have to fit together. Conference championship games. What does a new version of those look like? And 14 to me makes more sense because you have the two buys. You still have to make conference championship games in the two biggest conferences valuable to your fans and to TV networks, and they're not just going to give up on that money. So if you have the 14, two buys for the Big Ten and the SEC, as much as I hate it, that's going to happen, but that fits a little bit better than the 16 where no one gets a bye, because I don't know what you do with conference championship games at that point if you still do not make them valuable, if we're all if the conferences are still trying to generate as much revenue as they can.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Although now the conferences have gotten so big that they could make the argument, because you can't play everyone in your conference. So to have a true conference champion, that's where they could land on. Well, we still got to have a conference championship game to determine who. The interesting thing to me beyond that would be, okay, in the SEC, who are the other three? What's the criteria for being the other three automatic qualifiers? Same for the Big Ten. Um, you know, I know that in a 16 you end up with a 1 versus 16, and that might be a blowout. But you know, the fact that you got there, maybe. But then again, would they put in another stipulation? I know we're getting into the weeds here a little bit, but would they put in another stipulation where conference qualifiers from one conference can't play each other in the first round? And then you even get to, this was more of a concern of our colleague Dean Blevins the other night, the ninth conference game for the SEC. You know, they've held off.
Yep.
That's why Alabama's playing Wofford in November, or OU's playing Maine in November. because you only have 8 conference games. If you do this, it's going to be a 9th conference game. And Dean's take was, hey, we don't need any more SEC games right now with the way things are going.
Yeah, and that, by the way, has been kind of the take from what I understand about some of the lower tier teams in the SEC. Up until last year, the Vanderbilts of the world, when this was talked about in their meetings, which was the SEC has been split. Top half of the league didn't have a problem with it. Lower half of the league was like, wait a minute, are you kidding me? We got another loss that we could potentially be adding to this. I think that's where the guaranteed bids will take a little bit away from that, is as long as you have the criteria that you know that you have to meet and get to a certain place. I think they're fine with 9. The other thing that 9 does, and this was touched on in the Dellinger column. By the way, I'm a Dellinger stan, so I virtually read everything that he puts out there, John. So it's like I listen to his podcast too. He's been talking about this for the last year, which is 9 conference games also means that a couple of things happen. More revenue, and it also kicks in this scheduling agreement with the Big Ten that both conferences want to have. The Big Ten did not want to go into a scheduling agreement with the SEC because they weren't playing 9 conference games. Now that they have that on the table here, and they're going to have this handshake agreement, this also allows the SEC to go to the likes of ESPN and go, hey, oh, by the way, when's the last time you, ESPN, had Ohio State or Penn State on your airwaves? When's the last time you had Michigan in the Big House? It's been a while. It's been a while, especially in high-profile marquee games with this new television deal that you have. This is just another way for them to squeeze more money out of going and having the alliance there. But I think the overall plan to me is to have those guaranteed spots, however you determine them, and that could be a conversation for later, to kind of take away a little bit of the, oh my gosh, you're adding a 9th game.
Yeah, I should sum up my feeling on the whole thing with having been, and Pop, you can understand this to a great degree too, with your work with TU, but having worked with OSU for a long time too. If you're not a blue blood, you have to overachieve to an almost impossible degree to be included. So that's really, I guess, where I land on. Let's get it to 16. Then if you have a couple of automatic qualifiers from the Big 12, which, by the way, Big 12 doesn't necessarily like this plan. ACC doesn't necessarily like this plan, and it goes back to the number of automatic qualifiers for sure.
So that was my next question for you. If you're Brett Yormark, even though in a roundabout way, everyone's guilty, by the way, in giving up power to the SEC and the Big Ten because they threatened to take their ball and go do their own thing. Everyone's like, oh, wait, please don't do that. We'll write this in, and this has been in the works now for the last year. But if you're Yormark, do you necessarily have a problem with the 2 automatic bids? Because if you, like in Dellinger's piece, if you go back over the course of history, the Big 12 has been on average about having 2 bids in the first place.
Yeah, and that was that's the type of stuff that lends credibility to, okay, this is why we're doing this. Isn't just like a land grab from 2 conferences. When you can back it up like that, then that can make a little more sense. I guess that's I appreciate that type of reporting more than just giving blowhards airtime because they don't back up with it. He does. And I think if you're Brett Yormark, in the end, I mean, you make the noise and you make as good a points as you can. But at the end of the day, the history is what it is, and you're not going to be left out on this. You're going to fight for maybe a 3rd AQ and maybe knock one of them down, depending on a year-to-year thing, because that means more revenue for your conference too. You're going to fight, but in the end, you're going to give in.
Yeah, and I think about, obviously we can sit here and discuss Big Ten and SEC probabilities until we're blue in the face. I saw one that even said, Iowa would have been in the mix last year at 8-5 about potentially playing for a spot for the way in. And I don't think, judging by your reaction, I had an immediate eye roll as soon as I heard that. I'm like, I don't necessarily think that we need that. I was trying to think of it today, though, from a Big 12 perspective. Does it at least put more teams in play? We saw the number of games that increased in terms of college football playoff or Big 12 championship availability down the stretch, which I thought was was fascinating to see some of those games and how they played out. Now you add another team into that mix, depending on how the Big 12 wants to come about with this, whether it's a, hey, we have a champion here, and then we let, say Big 12 championship weekend now looks like 1 versus 4 and 2 versus 3, and then the winners move on and get those bids. That kind of at least increased my interest a little bit in deciding, or at least seeing how these conferences are going to decide who gets the bid and how.
Yeah, and I think that you'll have to go through, just like with this year and us talking about, let's give it a little time. Now that we've seen it, let's digest it before we start deciding the next move. It'd be the same way. I think you're going to have to make that, okay, look, if it's all about money, then this would have been done. I mean, they're trying to get it done yesterday, so then you get the package. If it's 14 or if it's 16, and then, okay, you adjust off of that. Because remember, the conference championship games, that wasn't just a given for every league. It had to go through a process of its own, and some leagues looking at others who are doing it, like the SEC, and said, oh, okay, well, that could be cool. Big 12 didn't do it for a while. Then they did do it, and then they didn't do it. They back and forth a little bit. I think when it comes down to the bottom line, it's, can you make money with a conference championship game, because you're still going to get 2 teams in.
Does this drastically change the entire process? Because to me, it does a little bit. If we rethink championship weekend, I think it changes a lot. And then the other thing that you have to think about as well is that, what does this do to the non-conference scheduling that happens? Because if you're giving direct criteria on, this is how that you get access to the college football playoff, either it's in the leagues that have 4 bids or 2 bids, does this increase the likelihood that you would schedule up in non-conference games if they don't necessarily, if it's not a death nail, to your season, losing that? It might hurt you in seeding at the end of the year, but it wouldn't necessarily crash your ability to get into the playoff if it's just going to be based off of conference record.
I think you're still kind of in a little bit of a Kansas State model, the old Kansas State model, where you had one.
Yeah, I'm going to be fascinated about what all comes out of this, and how they try to game the system for each other in a way. I'm still in the category of, I think this is a giant money grab, and that the biggest source of their revenue in a sport now, John, that requires more money than ever before, no matter what level that you play at, of trying to get as much out of the TV networks as you can. And you add games, you add the 9th conference game, you add whatever championship weekend looks like, then you're adding more playoff opportunities there. I mean, we keep talking about the sports bubble bursting in terms of TV revenue. That hasn't happened yet, but man, you're sinking a lot of faith in the fact that will never happen.
That's true. I wish we knew the end result right now to get ready to play for it. But then again, Pop, I wish that we knew who all was going to be on anyone's roster more than 1 year, the way it's going now. But now let's talk about one other football related note. And since we've been long-winded and we have great opinions, then let's advance it to this. You worked alongside Kevin Wilson for the last couple of years at TU. He's now going back to OU as an offensive analyst. We talked about this on the Blitz Sunday night. Dean and Toby both believe, his offensive expertise, which there's no question he's a great offensive mind, is going to help. But how much can he impact OU's offense this coming fall from an analyst position?
It's a good question. And it was, by the way, the fit is one that I had wondered about, a month or so after he was let go, whether or not that would be something that he would try to pursue, especially with his ties back to Venables and a lot of people that are on that staff. And Kevin, by the way, always spoke very highly of his time in Norman. There wasn't a time that I can remember where he did not speak glowingly about it. So to see that this had happened, not really a surprise. I'm intrigued by just the dynamic of going out and finding what was considered to be on the top 5 list of available offensive minds in the country to come in and rejuvenate that, knowing that Kevin has a particular style that he likes and how those two are going to mesh. Now, from an analyst perspective, the rules have changed. So he does have a little bit more freedom than what the traditional analyst role used to have during practice time and things. But I think more than anything, this is just Venables and Arbuckle trying to make sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed on every aspect of that offense, because they know that this is probably the most important hire that Brent has made since he's been head coach there. So I think anytime you can bring in someone that's as knowledgeable as what Kevin is about offense, and think tank it, which he is big on, and especially there towards the end of his tenure at Tulsa, it did turn into a think tank offense rather than just barking orders into a headset. If you can get the opinion of someone like that, I just think you're trying to make sure that you're getting the job done as much as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know Ben Arbuckle at all, but
Yeah.
When you're younger, you have success. There's a it doesn't take much for someone to believe in themselves to a point to whether maybe you're not as willing to, like, you'll hear them talk, but you won't really listen to what they're saying. But it would be wise, I think, to listen to your elders. As far as the ultimate impact, we may not really know because, as Coach Sutton always used to say in basketball, it's not as much about the X's and the O's as it is the Jimmies and the Joes. And if OU has enough good players on that offensive line and give the quarterback time to complete passes and move the football, if they can run it at all, then we're going to sit here after the season and say, hey, remember what we said about Kevin Wilson? Yeah, that really worked out pretty well, didn't it? And we may not really know the percentage of his impact unless Ben Arbuckle listens to him and they have, really good success.
I'm like you. I don't know Ben Arbuckle at all. I do think, though, that the situation is unique considering all of the talk around Jim Knowles on the other side of the ball when OU was courting him to potentially be their defensive coordinator, and the reasons why he allegedly left Ohio State, where maybe he just wasn't comfortable working in a situation like that where he didn't have complete control of the offense. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be from a young perspective. Sometimes you can get the older side of college coaches as well that are in there and like, hey, this is my system. I'm going to run it. You brought me in here to do a job. Now give me complete and free reign of it. I hope that, Ben Arbuckle is open to ideas like that.
Yeah. And it's you wonder how much that Venables may have consulted with Arbuckle before bringing him in. At least he would say something. You would think so. I know this much, Pop. We may not know the exact impact of Kevin Wilson on the OU offense in the fall, but it's going to work out better than the new All-Star Game format. And with that, for Pop, I'm John. Enjoy the weather.